Okay, everyone, welcome on this very snowy day. I'm glad to see this didn't deter you from coming to this, I think what's going to be a really interesting and enriching event. In case you haven't noticed, it's Eurasian Economic Union Week at the Harriman Institute. So yesterday we had a lecture by Minister for Regional Integration and Development, Volovaya, and today we have a related panel on what future for the Eurasian Economic Union, in which we have really assembled some of the leading experts in the world to talk about this issue. I'm Alex Cooley. I'm Deputy Director of Social Science Programming here at Harriman and Professor Barnard College, and I'm going to be your moderator tonight. One final note, this programming is also being conducted in cooperation with the Central Asia Institute and Program at GW, at George Washington University, and I want to acknowledge and thank Marlene for our continued cooperation. So there was a similar event in Washington, D.C. on Thursday, and we're delighted that some of the same participants can be here today to give us the policy perspective up here in New York. And that's something we're going to continue pursuing in the future. So we have 4 panelists for today, and the format's going to be the following. Our first panelist will give about a 20-minute overview, presentation, and then the other panelists about 10 minutes each in response, bringing their own perspectives. And our keynote panelist is, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Rilka Dragneva, who is senior lecturer in law at the University of Birmingham in the UK. So she's come a very long way, and she's missed flights and done a lot to be here tonight, so we're most appreciative. She has worked and published extensively in the area of legal reform, regional integration, and the EU's external policy with special reference to Eastern Europe and Eurasia, and she has extensive experience in technical assistance and consultancy in legal reform and the rule of law in post-communism. Her latest research and why she's here is that she's written a lot on the institutional architecture of the EU, and I have to say, sort of in researching the event, who we would want here, Rilka's name continuously just came up as the person who's really at the cutting edge of studying the EU as an institution with all of its quirks and politics and legal nuances. So we're just delighted to be here. And her recent publications include the Eurasian Economic Integration, Law, Policy, and Politics, and she's engaged in policy advice. After that, in the order of response, delighted to welcome back one of the Harriman Institute's own, we always claim as our own, Nate Schenkkan. He's the program officer in Eurasia programs at Freedom House, covering Central Asia and Turkey, and he closely works with Freedom House's Central Asia offices in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, implementing democracy and governance programs. He spent a lot of time in Central Asia, a lot of time in Turkey, and he writes prolifically on issues related to Central Asia and governance in Eurasia. And of late, I would say over the last year, he's had, 3 articles in Foreign Affairs online on the Eurasian Economic Union. So I think you've graduated from more just sort of a passing hobby, and you really have become a leading voice regarding the EU, its dynamics, before and after, and what the West should do vis-a-vis the EU. Our third speaker, Aitolkyn Kourmanova, or Aya, is head of the private consultancy Central Asia Strategic Management Group based in Almaty in Kazakhstan, so she's come even further, and so we welcome her here. Her recent publications include Regional Cooperation in Central Asia, Nurturing from the Ground, Lessons from China Ocean, Bringing Business, Government, Society Together, and she was a principal researcher for the 2 studies funded by the Asian Development Bank on remittances of international migrants and agricultural trade in Central Asia. So she has extensive experience working with a number of international organizations and think tanks and policy institutes. And she was a fellow at GW's Elliott School of International Affairs from April to August 2013, and the Hubert Humphrey Fellow in 2011 and 2012. So welcome, Maya. And then finally, Dr. Marlene Laruelle from George Washington University, where she is the director of the Central Asia program, the budding, blooming, very successful Central Asia program. We're delighted you're here, and research professor of international affairs. She has authored a number of different books: Russian Eurasianism, An Ideology of Empire, In the Name of the Nation, Nationalism and Politics, all things Central Asia, including globalizing Central Asia, the Chinese question in Central Asia, co-edited the volume China in India in Central Asia, and Mapping Central Asia, Indian Perceptions and Strategies. She's prolific, but she's also extremely insightful. So welcome to you all. So Rilka, I'll invite you to take the floor and give your presentation, and we're looking forward to a really good discussion.
Thank you very much, Alex. Okay, so the Eurasian Economic Union, it is the third attempt to create an international organization in the post-Soviet space, not the third to engage in economic integration, but definitely to create an international organization with its own separate international legal personality. And that is quite interesting because the Eurasian Economic Union is described as something that has already is a part of an impulse that's already 20 years old impulse. At the same time, it is described by its fathers, by its founding fathers, as an epoch-making. President Putin called it an epoch-making initiative. The narrative that has accompanied the creation of the Eurasian Economic Union is that it is a vehicle for functional economic integration, objective, logical, global processes of economic integration. It is rule-based, it's consistent with WTO and international law norms, that it is based on constraint asymmetry and partners are equal, and that it is better than the EU, not only because of the equality that it offers, but also because it actually mitigates some of the problems that the European Union encountered in its development. Therefore, it's been presented as a natural center for attraction, not just for its neighbors, but also countries further afield, such as Vietnam, New Zealand, and so on. And very importantly for the European Union recently, as an equal partner to the EU, with the increasing growing demand for an inter-bloc free trade-based agreement. Now, what I will argue is that against this context, the emergence of the EU in 2015 firstly, it adds very little to the substantive integration project. If anything, it diverts resources from actually consolidating the achievements of that have preceded it. It serves primarily an external purpose, and it has become increasingly Russia's main foreign policy tool. And the way things have become, there are actually more questions about its viability and rule-based economic functionality. A lot of the existing fault lines have been exposed, and some of the achievements that have been reached have actually been undone. Looking at what preceded it, the customs union and the single economic space, customs union launched in 2010, single economic space launched in 2012. In terms of the substance of integration, what it is about. It's about a free trade area with exemptions, energy, for example. It's a partial customs union. It has a common import tariff with exemptions on import duties, and it doesn't cover export duties. So partial customs union, no internal customs borders, a great achievement nonetheless relative to the previous 20 years of post-Soviet integration. To all of that was added the single economic space agenda in 2012, entailing coordination across 17 policy areas, but also growingly recognition of the importance of dealing with non-tariff barriers, technical standards, sanitary, phytosanitary standards, and so on. In terms of the legal and institutional basis, Again, the important thing is, and again, it's something that made a lot of observers rejoice when it happened. It was a very surprising, positive development back then. Improved, modernized legal framework, especially the customs code that was adopted in 2009. Having a permanent regulator in charge of dealing with the common customs regulatory issues, the Eurasian Economic Commission at the moment, extensive delegation to it, including power to adopt routine decisions, not sensitive decisions, but routine decisions by a 2/3 majority. What a young colleague has called, it suffers from the so-called Belarus elevator symptom, whereby if a decision is not reached at the lower levels, it's gradually escalated to the upper floors until it reaches the heads of state and government. But nonetheless, binding decisions, unprecedented, has the power to change domestic legislation. And also, because its decisions are binding and have such an important potentially effect on commercial actors, there is the provision that such actors can appeal the Commission's decisions before the court of the Eurasian, well, at that time it was the court of the Eurasian Economic Community, now it's a different court of the Eurasian Economic Union. The other thing that's quite important, WTO consistent, subject sort of the WTO legislation and Russia's accession protocol obligations take precedence and apply even to non-members of WTO, and indeed formal equality. One country, one vote. Sensitive issues are decided by consensus. Now, the fault lines. Certainly, the legal basis needs a lot of improvement. It was fragmented. The customs union, the customs code needed a lot of revision. There were issues that instantly became clear about division of competencies between national and customs union authorities. And most importantly, domestic implementation was not actually factored in the whole project. It's a sort of top-down project with very little attention to domestic implementation. Things get done, disciplines work because the heads of state, the president has ordered for them to happen. Poor rule compliance, and things like, for example, the Commission adopts a decision which should be binding. The Russian Customs Service adopts another decision, presumably to introduce the Commission's decision into Russia's legislation, which actually doesn't need to do because it's directly binding. But anyway, it does it, and in doing so, it slightly modifies the decision of the Customs Union Commission. So there are things like that, issues of administrative capacity, how do you deal with borders, customs borders, rules of origin, and so on. WTO compliance, I said the regime is WTO consistent broadly, but doesn't necessarily, we've seen that does not necessarily mean WTO compliance. And in a way, there is, for example, been one very peculiar decision of the court whereby it was ruled that the law of the customs union is specific to the law of the WTO. Whatever that means, we'll see. And generally, the main problems are that it's top-down integration agenda, little scope for consolidation, politically determined deadlines, fast pace of development, and de facto hegemony of Russia, whereby progression achieving the union has been done very much based on Russia's agenda via issue linkages, energy for integration, and especially the dominance of the external agenda. So we come to 2015, 2014 May, when the treaty was signed. What is the effect of the economic union? In terms of the substance of integration, I don't think one can describe it as epoch-making in any event. It is the same thing, free trade area with exemptions, partial customs union, with a timetable for removing exemptions with 3 phases. So still a lot of scope for conditionality and things to happen or not to happen. The legal basis is codified and tidied up, but again, it is done very much with, for example, the need to have this union was at the cost of, for example, not producing a revised customs union code, which is very, very necessary. And things like, for example, the new treaty provides that the specificity of domestic institutions should not be disturbed. Very much a sort of a signal that there is nothing that should be touched as far as domestic governance is concerned, the way the domestic administrations are run. Even less of a union. We've seen that there are a lot of sort of growth of increase of sovereignty sensitivities. There is certainly, if one looks at successive drafts of the treaty, there is a greater concern for sovereignty and equality reflected in successive drafts. And a lot of, you see member states, especially Kazakhstan, but also Belarus, imposing limitations on their commitments and quite willing, as we've seen recently, to retaliate to various Russian measures, and renewed interest in multi-vector policy. Kazakhstan managed to complete and sign a new agreement with the European Union. Belarus, as we know, is it's one of the main foreign policy achievements of Lukashenko relates to the Minsk agreements. Integration undone. In the context of the sanctions, we've seen Russia's unilateral departure from the common customs tariff. So we have what I described as a partial customs union, but still a customs union operating on the basis of a common import tariff, which at the moment it's no more, because actually Russia applies unilateral measures. But also we've seen, especially relations with Belarus, introduction of customs borders, trade wars with a range of commodities, and Kazakhstan as well. In terms of the external agenda, what we've seen is a very poor ability to make a comprehensive case for the benefits of joining the Eurasian Economic Union. And what we've also seen is that new memberships, as well as progression through the stages of economic integration, have been mainly assured through a web of Russia-centered bilateral arrangements related to things that are actually outside the Eurasian Economic Union agenda, such as finance, energy, still outside the EU agenda, and security, especially as far as Armenia is concerned. And we've also seen that the Eurasian Economic Union has been most clearly deployed as a tool in the Ukraine crisis. And at the moment, via this claim for establishing interbloc relationships with the European Union, it has very much become a way to assert precedence vis-à-vis the European Union and seek to recapture the lost members, so to speak. If one examines more clearly Russia's trade objections to the association agreement of Ukraine, it is very clear that it tries to speak on behalf of the Eurasian Economic Union, but it is not so much functional arguments that you actually see. There's more strongly arguments about precedence of integration regimes, and very much not about what the rules are and how we can functionally make them fit with each other, but actually about who sets the rules. So the European Union in particular is in a very tough predicament. In 2010, when the customs union was launched, the European Union basically had no policy. It was monitoring developments and was very concerned about WTO, Russia's accession to the WTO, and the fate of its new agreement with Russia. And it had a lot of sort of specific concerns, such as what I've listed here. And there was a gradual build-up of so-called trade irritants, which are reflected in various EU documents. A policy that was, a non-policy that was actually criticized by a range of scholars, business people, policymakers, What we've seen in 2015 is a call for formal recognition of the EU and interbloc free trade relations benefits, well, the benefits correcting the EU policy, a certain anomaly that you have European Union businesses filling in customs union, Eurasian customs union declarations and finding themselves as parties to proceedings before the court of the Eurasian Economic Union, for example, with no formal relations at the top. The Eastern Partnership policy and debates there, and in fact, the fact that EU's Russia's policy was in crisis actually even before the whole Eurasian Economic Union came on the agenda. And ultimately, the main benefit at the moment is clearly peace, achieving peace in Ukraine. And the German government has been particularly kind of keen to push for that agenda. Now, my argument and my take on that is that we need a comprehensive review of policies, actually, and that it is not an easy predicament in the sense that if one actually looks at it, there aren't many inter-regional agreements that one can look at. The European Union has tried to establish relationships with Mercosur, with relationships with ASEAN. They're pretty much connected to situations when you have countries that are already WTO members. This is a fairly unique situation in the sense that Kazakhstan and Belarus are still not WTO members. Well, and especially the case of Belarus is even more problematic. And it's so on this basis, actually, it is a difficult thing to think of how you can structure such a policy. However, having said that, it is for me imperative that one shouldn't be blind about the fact that the EU and the EU cannot be deemed to be functional equivalents. In a way, if anything, in my opinion, the Eurasian Economic Union at the moment is even less like the EU than the promise it contained back in 2010. At the moment, it has become even more Russia's foreign policy tool. And actually trying to think that Kremlin's, and I would distinguish between Russia's and Kremlin's core preferences, will not be met necessarily by a business-as-usual technocratic trade-based solution. In addition to that, there are huge costs in the sense that there is certainly one is the European Union's reputation, but also marginalization of neighbors, marginalization of Ukraine, but also given that Russia has dominated the agenda of the Eurasian Economic Union, it's actually also marginalizing countries like Belarus and Kazakhstan and now the new members of the Eurasian Economic Union. Now, I'm far from concluding that the US has an easier predicament in dealing with this situation and devising a coherent and principled policy on the subject. I find that a very useful resource is there is two annual reports by the U.S. Trade Representative on the implementation of the Magnitsky Act, which provide a very, very good source and show that, again, like the European Union, the U.S. is monitoring developments very closely. But certainly, I have a very difficult job within Europe to try and persuade a lot of colleagues that the German proposals should not necessarily be taken at face value, and there shouldn't be a knee-jerk reaction of actually accepting Russia's demand, because I don't think that would actually secure peace. So I'll stop here.
Great. I'm going to do it from down here, if that's all right, just because it'll be a little more comfortable, a little less formal. Thank you. So this will be a sort of compressed version of the talk I gave at Marlene's conference last week, and many of the things that you'll hear me saying are very much picking up on the themes and the points that Rilka just made. The question that we just heard laid out, and I think this has become the core question about the Eurasian Economic Union in 2014 and now 2015, is to what extent it will continue to develop as a rules-based institution. The original promise and the original excitement for those who follow Eurasia that was felt regarding the customs union, regardless of your feelings about its economic rationale or about the pace of integration, was that it appeared to be operating as a rules-based institution, and it appeared to be instituting a new form of regional institutionalism in Eurasia, in a region that has a long history of hollow or virtual regionalism. And so the question for the Eurasian Economic Union was whether it would continue that development, and if it did, how would it grapple then with the very difficult economic and governance contradictions that all the people following the issue saw looming. In actuality, following the Ukraine crisis, following the Russian economic crisis, which has now become the Eurasian economic crisis, I think it should be called that, I think this question has been answered, and what has happened instead is that the Eurasian Economic Union has trended quite sharply away from being rules-based and from building on the promise of the customs union. Now, I've been talking a lot about this over the past few days, including at Marlene's conference. I think it's a question of trajectory and of where does the EU go if it continues in this trajectory. We are looking at a very distinct moment in time after an incredible, unprecedented year for Russia, for Ukraine, for the rest of Eurasia. And so while we've seen a rapid turn, there's certainly possibilities that things could turn in a different direction. And as Rilka said, I think there still is an institutional basis in the customs union. That is increasingly under threat as well. But it does still exist, and I am wary of overstating to say that this has all disappeared and vanished. There's still about 1,000 people working in the commission in Moscow. It's still an institution. These people are still going to work. They're still doing their jobs. At the same time, the trajectory is going away from all of these jobs that are being done having any direct and rules-based, orderly meaning for Eurasian integration. So why am I making this argument? Why do I say this? As we heard already, there have been these distinct events in very public events in 2014 in trade relations. The clearest one, of course, is the counter-sanctions that Russia imposed unilaterally without consultation with Belarus or Kazakhstan. This was at the time when only Belarus and Kazakhstan were in the customs union. Belarus and Kazakhstan rejected agreeing to those sanctions. There was no indication that these had been negotiated or consulted with the union partners. And now that problems have erupted on the basis of those unilateral actions by Russia, and both on the basis of those and on the basis of the ruble crisis, which is causing an enormous number of Kazakhs, but also Belarusians, to enter Russia to purchase goods in enormous volumes. That is leading to a number of real restrictions on cross-border trade. And so, as we already heard, the customs union itself is starting to break down as the actual unified tariff zone is no longer being implemented in actuality. We just had the next stage of this was, I think, just yesterday that Kazakhstan imposed a 45-day block on import of Russian petrol and diesel fuel, complete block, that I think goes into effect in 3 days. The second issue I want to bring that isn't discussed as much, but I think is also very significant from a conceptual basis and ties into this problem of the rapid expansion, that this was a year when on paper the EU succeeded. It grew by 2 members. It captured a larger territory and showed that it was a viable project. That is actually undermining the union itself. The issue of Nagorno-Karabakh is a very clear example of this. Kazakhstan has been uncomfortable with Armenia and Kyrgyzstan's accession at the speed and on the terms that were offered, probably because Kazakhstan worries about labor migration from Kyrgyzstan and fears having its influence watered down by adding 2 Russian client states to the Union. In the case of Armenia, Kazakhstan tried to slow this process down by insisting that Armenia would not join with Nagorno-Karabakh, that it would have to build a customs post on its border with Nagorno-Karabakh, where there is no customs post. And Armenia didn't really have much of a leg to stand on in this argument because Nagorno-Karabakh says that it's independent, that it's an independent republic. Armenia says that Nagorno-Karabakh is an independent republic. Internationally, legally, it is not recognized as part of either Armenia or as an independent republic. It's still considered part of Azerbaijan for most of its territory. And so there really is no way around this. Kazakhstan says, and members of the commission say, that they got an oral promise from Armenia that there would be a customs post on this border. However, there is no language to that effect in Armenia's accession treaty. The Armenian government in local media was very outspoken right after the treaty was signed to say that there would be no customs post. And so already at the very moment of expansion, this was in May, when this was happening, May and early June, at the very moment of expansion, of triumph and success, we have essentially the first new member coming in and saying there will be no external border in this one place, and we have no intention of enforcing one. And there were no penalties for that. There's been there appears to be no interest in enforcing penalties or pursuing that. Last night, when I asked Minister Volova about this, she said that it wasn't significant because Nagorno-Karabakh is so economically insignificant for the Union and because it has limited open borders itself, which I don't think is a very satisfactory answer. So those are a couple of public things that I think are very important for understanding why we are talking about it in this way, and what happened in 2014. And then I want to talk quickly about some more specific issues regarding the treaty itself. That in the first talk mentioned the treaty negotiations and how, as it went through, some of these elements of sovereignty came to be stronger and stronger. So I looked at a draft EU treaty that was released in April 2014 from Kazakhstan's Ministry of Economy and Budget Planning. They put this on the internet, of all places. This was about 2 months before the actual signing. So this is a very late stage draft. It's quite far along in the process. It's not at a stage where it's where a lot of the big headline grabbing stuff had already been stripped out. Things like currency, unified currency, or a parliament, all this kind of fancy stuff had already been taken away. We're really down to talking about economic issues. What's interesting about this draft, which was partial, this was 2 chapters out of 4, but 74 out of 118 articles, so the bulk of the treaty. What's interesting about it is that it preserved within it which reservations and requests for changes the parties to the negotiation had made at that stage. So you can see what Kazakhstan was asking for, what Russia was asking for, what Belarus, and what the Commission was proposing also. So there, again, small number of changes. I count, and it's a little more art than science because some of them are very minor, it might be a word here. I count 19 requests from Kazakhstan for changes, 28 from Russia, 9 from Belarus, and 6 proposals from the Commission. Now, of the 56 member state submissions, nearly all of them are directed at weakening either the policy forming and implementing role of the Commission or the pace or quality of integration. And barely any of the changes, really fewer than 5, maybe less than 2 or 3, are directed at strengthening the policy forming and implementing role of the Commission and the pace or quality of integration. And I want to highlight, because I think this is an important point I'll come back to, this includes Russia's request for changes. Russia is also at this stage trying to weaken the integration role and the policy forming and implementing role of the institutions of the EU. So some of the most important changes that we see here, differences between the draft treaty and the final treaty. In the sphere of energy, which is obviously very important for the Eurasian economic space. The draft had these 4 points that elaborated a fairly comprehensive role for the Commission for it to monitor, oversee, and plan the formation of a common energy market, which is scheduled to happen in about 10 years. Russia objected to this article in toto and asked that it be eliminated entirely. Kazakhstan objected, trying to eliminate the Commission's role on forming a common electricity market. In the final version of the treaty, you have what was 4 points is now only 1, and it says only that the Commission is responsible for monitoring of implementation of the process of formation of a common energy market. In creating a unified financial market, the draft had a proposal to create a supranational organ that would be intended to regulate the unified financial market. Russia objected and said that creating financial integration requires another international agreement. We're not ready. That's essentially what's reflected in the final treaty, which is that the supranational organ will only be established in 2025, which is supposed to be when integration of the financial markets is completed. And the commitment, the actual treaty commitment is very vague, and it's just a harmonization of financial legislation. And then in labor migration, this will be the last specific one I'll mention. In labor migration, there was an article that on the entry, exit, and residing of citizens of member states, and this was the only one that had a point establishing the right of citizens, the right to enter, exit, transit, move, and reside in any territory in the Union. And Kazakhstan objected to this article, and it was, in fact, struck from the final treaty. Labor migration is still covered in the final treaty, but not in nothing like as comprehensive a way. And actually, the freedom of movement of labor is nowhere near as free as one would expect for what is called a single economic space. It's really actually quite constrained. So I'm moving somewhat quickly, but and I could give more examples because there's a number of different areas like this. I think the takeaway for me is that, yes, I think there's now a consensus emerging that the Eurasian Economic Union has moved away from the rules-based promise of the customs union. There's definitely a trajectory away from that. I think the bigger outstanding question is about what Russia's intentions are for the union. And my opinion, my analysis, based on my analysis, is that I actually think Russia is moving away from attempting genuine integration. I think Russia has lost interest in the actual integration project, and I think is returning to a more traditional Russian posture of seeing any kind of supranational body as a threat to sovereignty. And in that way, they're undercutting the institutions as well themselves. They still want to retain, Russia still seeks to retain the propaganda value and the publicity value of the union. That's why the expansion was so crucial in 2014. That's why Putin and President Sisi of Egypt are the ones who announced the prospective formation of a free trade zone instead of having that announced in some fashion relating to the Commission or the Eurasian Economic Union. But I don't think that Russia is actually seeking to use the EEU's mechanisms to dominate. I think it will seek to assert its hegemony through other mechanisms, bilateral mechanisms that it has available with its partners. And the EU itself, it's hard to say what will happen to those 1,000 people in Moscow. But if it continues in this way, gradually their function is going to wither away as they become less and less relevant to the real trade situation and the real economic relationships among the countries. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So, this is working. So the concept of the Eurasian Union has become really somewhat of a constant factor for Kazakhstan's policy, and I'm going to speak about Kazakhstan's view today. Kazakhstan really considers itself as a founding father of the Eurasian Economic Union, as President Nazarbayev spoke about it already 20 years ago, where he suggested that integration should be done in a gradual, multi-level process based on economic reasoning but not on political priorities. Since then, it seems that Kazakhstan has views the future of Eurasia pretty much in the same format as of an open and friendly market. Even in his most recent remarks to the public audience, President Nazarbayev said that people should not blame the EU for all economic difficulties that the country is currently facing. But the idea of the Eurasian Union remains, in my view, too distant and vague for many in Kazakhstan, who still continue to perceive it as their president's brainchild. First, because Kazakhs have not developed their own thinking paradigm towards the Eurasianism, and most of domestic arguments are based on Russian thought. And the second reason why Eurasianism is still viewed with skepticism in Kazakhstan is that actually domestic and economic business actors had not yet validated the Eurasian concept, so to say. The unrealization of the economic gains in the EU, of course, happened largely due to the external factors. The event in the outside world, the Russia-West conflict, and the prices and the drop of oil prices had, of course, brought serious challenges to the Eurasian outlook as a whole and elevated security and economic risks for Kazakhstan as well. As a result, the worsened external environment affects now a foreign policy balance, economic growth, and internal stability. And these are actually three main pillars of Kazakhstan's post-independence development and personal regime of President Nazarbayev. Yes, the Eurasian integration is critical for a landlocked Kazakhstan with a small domestic market and its dependence on natural resources. And it was actually expected that the EU will open up the Russian market for Kazakhs, and foreign investors will come to Kazakhstan to set up various diversified industrial productions. But this had not realized so far, and the data shows actually a decline of mutual trade and low mutual investment within the Eurasian Union. According to Kazakh statistics, Kazakhstan's trade with Russia fell by 20% in 2 years from 2012 to 2014, and trade with Belarus fell by 15% in the same period. Kazakh exports to Belarus shrunk particularly seriously by almost 2/3. The FDI in Kazakhstan has been actually declining from 2012, and there was no pickup in these dynamics, although because there is a particular reduced interest from the West towards the Kazakh oil and mining projects, and as overall tightening of the domestic investment regime. The effect of the Russian economic decline is yet to be felt, but the government already projected that GDP growth in Kazakhstan in 2015 will be only 1.5%, which is the lowest rate since 1999. And the new budget that the government revised for 2015 expects that exports will fall by some 40% in money terms, and this is, of course, reflects the impact of the external factors. But there are other factors which impede Kazakh competitiveness in the Eurasian Economic Union. In my view, the Eurasian Union in its current form appears to be highly asymmetric and an inward-looking bloc. Although it seems to expand geographically, it maintains high common external tariff with other countries. And the fact is that the members of the Eurasian Union do not trade with each other as much as they trade with the rest of the world. The EU excludes China, which emerged as one of the main trade partners for all of Central Asian states and for Kazakhstan in particular. And as the Eurasian Union imposes higher tariff, this actually diverts trade in countries which import from China. Even Russia's main trade partner is not the CIS, but EU. Russia's trade with the EU is about 50%, while the trade with Kazakhstan and Belarus represents only some 7% of the total volume. And what is of particular worry is that a higher tariff towards EU and China also means that there will be less imported technology from these more technologically advanced countries. So as the Eurasian Union has a high asymmetry in the size of its member states, Russian economy is 10 times bigger than Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan has discovered that it has really big problems with its own competitiveness. It may have entered the ranks of 50 most competitive countries, according to some rankings, but it still faces that such factors of production like labor, capital, and resources, they remain too expensive in Kazakhstan to compete successfully around the world and in the Eurasian Economic Union in particular. Of course, competitiveness of Kazakhstan economy is being hampered by mostly domestic factors. There is a high dependence on natural resource sector, there are higher production costs, there are problems with the banking sector, everything plays a role here. But and Kazakh economy remains to be more import-oriented, and its largest exporters all sit in oil and mining sectors. Since 2005, Kazakhstan actually started to implement its large multi-billion public support to its manufacturing sector, and it tried to raise local competitiveness with the help of such institutions as Funds Kazin and Samruk and industrialization and innovation programs. But with all that support, which again can be measured in billions of dollars, they emerged only a small manufacturing sector, which is highly dependent on state subsidies and protection. So to a large extent, I can state that a low competitiveness of Kazakh business, unprepared to the realities of the large, attractive, and protected markets such as Russia, led to under-realization of the Eurasian targets as a whole. Kazakhstan had to compete not only with Russian or Belarusian producers, which had better exposure to the European standards, but also with producers from other countries, for example, with Poland for the share of agricultural and food market. And the Russian market is very attractive, not only for the developing economies, but for the developed industries and innovative technologies. And it is no wonder that Kazakhstan found itself less competitive with the rest of the world for the Russian market. So there are these unrealized targets of the Eurasian integration for Kazakhstan, and Kazakh people as a whole see that the integration process is a little bit politicized from the Russian side, and this actually caused a popular concern, particularly among business sector and nationalistic groups. The National Chamber of Entrepreneurs, an organization which emerged only in 2013 with the help of such a high-profile businessman as Timur Kulibayev, president's son-in-law, had been particularly vocal in asking for more protective measures and subsidies from the government. The National Chamber now includes all national, small, medium, and large businesses, and it leads an important work informing policymakers on the situation in the local community. But it had been created only 2 years ago when the problems with the local competitiveness had become really obvious. And as a whole, this chamber still addresses the problems of producers, while producers is a class which is not entirely recognized in Kazakh society, which is less industrialized and import-oriented, and where consumers have a large influence. So an example of this asymmetry, when customs union was created, there were many people opposing it, but they were mainly car owners in Kazakhstan. The country's car market was booming at that time, and many people had been engaged in business by bringing imported cars from the US, Germany, or Japan, and there were also many people who made living by cars. And this year, these car owners are very happy because they went to Russia for shopping, and they found really cheap cars, and they don't care that this drove prices down and almost killed the local car manufacturing business. They just don't care because they care about their pocket. So it's really difficult to see in the longer term what economic gains for Kazakhstan will be from the Eurasian Economic Union. And the current crisis which Russia has found itself in will probably prompt Russia to be more protective of her own economy rather than help others. And for me, a particular worry is that Kazakhstan currently unpacked its national fund, where the oil revenues were saved for future generations. And in my view, Kazakhstan really risks spending too much on protecting and subsidizing its producers in this race for the competitiveness within the Eurasian Union. With the long-term economic effects still unclear and domestic disputes really increasing, the debate within Kazakhstan about the EU has grown more polarized, and President Nazarbayev himself has become somewhat more critical of the customs union and the Eurasian Economic Union. And he still emphasizes that Kazakhstan's sovereignty is not compromised, but on the other hand, we see the remarks from Vladimir Putin that Kazakh statehood is something of a very vague thing, and that really outraged people in Kazakhstan, especially from the nationalistic sectors, nationalistic circles. The thing is that Kazakh society on a whole does not want to be fenced off the rest of the world, and this is their primary concern with the EU and its closed nature. The Eurasian Development Bank, for example, made a survey in 2014, and it revealed that still there are something like 85% of respondents in Kazakhstan who support the country's accession to the Eurasian Economic Union. It is one of the highest in the CIS and much higher than in Russia itself. But the survey also noted increased skepticism towards the role of the EU as a center of investment, education, and knowledge. For example, Kazakh respondents want to see more investors from the European Union and Asian countries. They want to have more cooperation in research and development with non-CIS countries, and large numbers also stated that they would prefer to be educated in EU and Asian countries rather than CIS. So maybe it's time really to be more honest and to recognize that Kazakhstan could be more competitive in a less ambitious project, more symmetric and regionalized market with less exclusive benchmarks than competition with mature suppliers implies. And following this South-South cooperation logic, Kazakhstan may be particularly competitive on the Central Asian market. For example, despite limitations of the EU, trade within Central Asia has been growing for the last several years. And Central Asia remains a principal market for the Kazakhstan non-oil exports. Kazakhstan should be really honest. As Kyrgyzstan is, Central Asia is the only market that is really feasible for Kazakh non-oil exports. And probably a CIS free trade zone agreement can facilitate trade with such neighbors as Uzbekistan, which is currently negotiating this agreement with EU. In fact, the CIS free trade zone would be beneficial for many CIS countries because it is about economic cooperation without any political umbrella. In any way, I think that the broader and more open vision in terms of the Eurasian integration would be better for Kazakhstan at this moment. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So many things have already been said, so I will be very brief and just make three kind of main points. The first one is that what is political and what is economic in all this discussion are kind of very blurry and opaque. And that, of course, make our analysis more difficult, and that also make the perception in the region about what is really the Eurasian Economic Union also particularly complex. So you have on one side intentions by the states and the political authorities, and then you have the outcome. Sometimes the outcome are not linked to what were the intentions. Sometimes there is kind of unexpected outcome that are not really linked to intention and so on. So I think this is an important point, and the technical debate that is really going on inside the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a very important one, because at the first time that there is really this kind of technical debates about norms, rules, customs, and so on, is important, but it's kind of also put in parallelized or overlooked by the political noise going on around the Eurasian Union and its geopolitical kind of overarching picture. So I think that's an interesting point to have this kind of geopolitical debates, and then the realm of action is economic. And I think that, and I agree with what has been said, that probably, I mean, the Eurasian Economic Union was primarily the codification of the already functioning custom union, and probably deeper provision in terms of energy market and so on will probably not be implemented because, as we have said, there are less interest by the member state now to really push for more integration. So probably we won't see any major progress in terms of integration, but the political narrative will probably continue because it's structural for the three regimes in Kazakhstan, in Russia, and in Belarus. And the three presidents themselves have been so personally invested in bringing this Eurasian Union with them that, of course, if they try to diminish them, that would probably impact their own legitimacy. And that's clear for Nazarbayev. He's probably the most committed, but that's also something important for Putin and for Lukashenko. So that was my first point. The second one is the timing. And the timing is, of course, very unfortunate for Russia. Because first 2014 Ukrainian crisis, 2015 economic crisis. And on that, I really also follow what has been said, that I think we see now very clearly Russia reaffirming state sovereignty as being something absolutely crucial, even inside the Eurasian Union, and being more important than its commitment to regional integration. We see Russia clearly downplaying the functionalities or the potentialities of the Eurasian Economic Union, disregarding its trade obligation, becoming more and more protectionist. And of course, the current economic crisis, the devaluation of the ruble, is drastically impacting this the Russian commitment to the Eurasian Union, and the one by Belarus and Kazakhstan, who also feel like they have to protect their own economy. And clearly also from the Russian perspective, I mean, the Eurasian Economic Union had Ukraine as this kind of the big piece you wanted to get to celebrate the reconstruction of a regional space. Now that Ukraine is lost for regional integration, the only really kind of big piece is in Kazakhstan. But for the other country, let's be honest, it's more economically. They are all political clients of Russia, but economically, they are more a burden than a blessing. I mean, getting Kyrgyz economy, Tajik economy, Armenia is not, it's a political gain more than an economic one. So it's probably also impact the Russian perception. And another element that seems also to me important is that we tend to forget the Russian public opinion position on the Eurasian Economic Union. And that's also something which is interesting, is that the Russian public opinion is very much in favor of Eurasia if it means Russia's great powerness and recognition on the international scene. If it means Eurasian Economic Union, then the Russian public opinion is no more interested in that, because what they see by the Eurasian Economic Union, it's we will be investing in remote backward countries in the south, and we will have more and more labor migrants. And as you know, xenophobia has been really one of the driving force. So on that, Putin has been really going against his own public opinion in continuing to say, yes, we will do this Eurasian Economic Union, and then, yes, there will be free mobility inside the Eurasian Economic Union. So on that, he's going against his public opinion. And I think the Ukrainian crisis, because he shifts really the Russian debates about national identities and what is really important back to the West, with the fact that, okay, the real issue is our relationship with the West, with NATO, with Europe, our relationship with Ukraine as being part of Russianness or not. That really shifts the focus. And so in sociological surveys in Russia, the xenophobia topics is kind of now almost in the shadow, because all the public attention following the Russian media, of course, offensive is looking west and over Ukraine and no more toward migrants. But I think even if xenophobia is less visible, it's still a driving kind of element of the Russian society, and that would be relatively difficult for the regime, especially if the economic crisis continue, to mobilize the public opinion in favor of an economic union with countries that are considered as the one we don't want, while the real issues are considered as being playing in the western part of the country and not in the southern one. So I think that's, on the medium term, that's also something that will probably impact the Russian involvement, and it's the role of the economic crisis in relationship to xenophobia is still something that we have to look at. And my third point, very briefly, on the other Central Asian states that are in the process of entering. Kyrgyzstan, they signed the agreement in December. They should enter May 1st. And Tajikistan, probably the next one on its in the pipe of integration. For them, of course, in a sense, the Eurasian Economic Union, the discussion around the Eurasian Economic Union are suddenly less important than the economic crisis. And that's really what we have to realize, that in the region, the real issue is the economic crisis. The Eurasian Union is kind of very secondary issue now, and that's something important. So for Kyrgyzstan, entering the Eurasian Economic Union would drastically change, the way the country shaped its economy. It will, of course, mean tightening custom control with China, while China has been the key trading partner of Kyrgyzstan. It will also create a lot of issues with Uzbekistan, and Nate mentioned the Nagorno-Karabakh point. The same things will happen at the Uzbek-Kyrgyz border, where you have half of the territories of the border along the Fergana Valley that is not delimited, with several enclaves or exclaves that are kind of very difficult to control, it kind of out of the law system. So that will be very difficult for Kyrgyzstan to kind of implement any kind of custom border or checkpoint with Uzbekistan on that side of its border. But the good point would be, of course, for Kyrgyzstan to suddenly see the elimination of the Kyrgyz-Kazakh custom border, which has been something very sensitive in Kyrgyzstan. Another big element is that Bishkek is hoping for the establishment of this Kyrgyz-Russian Development Fund that would suddenly bring more Russian money to be invested in the Kyrgyz economy. It would also mean higher collection of taxes, so more money for the government budget. And of course, the big elephant in the room is the remittances, because you have so many hundreds of thousands of Kyrgyz migrants working in Russia that it's really for them the key issue. And the numbers we have now from the coming back to Central Asia of labor migrants are relatively dramatic and catastrophic. I think we need to relativize them because it's winter time, so in any case migrants are going back. But the real issue will be what we will see in 1 month, early April. If we don't see this flow of migrants going back to Russia, then that would mean that probably the price to pay politically, socially, in terms of having suddenly hundreds of thousands of migrants staying at home, trying to find a place on the local job market and no more going to Russia, that will be a big issue for the Central Asian countries. And the last one, Tajikistan. Well, for Tajikistan, it's even much more simpler, is that its remittances are nothing. Because there is really, entering the Eurasian Economic Union, it's all about remittances and migrants. Of course, the Tajik authorities also hope for more Russian investment, but the migrant issue are really crucial for them. And we have an impressive number that about 1/3 of Tajik migrants have been put on the blacklist of the Russian authorities for having not respected anything related to their status in Russia. But the day Tajikistan will enter officially, legally, all these restrictions should disappear, which means that you have about 200,000 people in Tajikistan who now cannot work anymore in Russia because they are they are on the blacklist of migration. Well, they can go and be illegal, of course, or undocumented, but they can no more go legally. And of course, that will be a big push, a big pressure put on the Tajik authorities for entering the Eurasian Economic Union. And clearly, from the sociological survey we see that really all families where you have migrants, where money remittances play an important part of the household, they are all pushing for entering the Eurasian Economic Union. So that's also explained the kind of pro-Russian narrative that you easily find among the Central Asian population. So I think for them, the big issue, it's not only the Eurasian Economic Union, it's just globally, what is the future of Russia's economy? And what does that mean if suddenly there is no more work in Russia, or less work, or more work in the shadow economy with more difficulties, more corruption, but not way of legalizing themselves in the Russian system, and also less economic commitment of Russia in their own economy. And I think that's for them the big key issue, is that, well, Russia is not the perfect neighbor, but not having Russia invested in the region is the worst scenario you can imagine for them. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Wow. So what a difference a year makes in terms of our outlook of this organization and where it's heading, and all of the fascinating dynamics that you've illuminated. And I guess, I'll start off the questioning just with this sort of observation. In international relations theory, when we look at regional integration, a lot of our models are based on this kind of rationalist assumption about, trade is the easy part, and then you sort of have this, gradual set of competencies and rules, and you spill over into new areas, and, RTAs, demonstrate that they can, credibly commit to sort of enforcing these rules, and then they expand the rules and so forth. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is sort of, the kind of constructivist vein of international relations that view regions, like Peter Katzenstein would, as regions of identity, right? Regions of normative spaces, as sort of Chris Borgen has talked about, right? And so my question to you is, in this internal debate that's going on now everywhere, right? Russia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and so forth, what are the arguments that are being made, if they're being made, regarding the advantages of the EU and belonging to the EU? Are there appeals to sort of economic self-interest, like I was talking about, right? Whether this really is for the better of the country, whether it advantages certain sectors, certain producers, or is the argument more about normative belonging and geopolitical orientation, or is it both? And maybe give us a sense of when the EU is being debated, what kind of arguments are being made regarding its future?
I can speak a little bit about Kyrgyzstan, I guess, and I'll leave Kazakhstan to someone who's from there, or to others. Kyrgyzstan, where I've been a lot for the past several months, it's it's happening on both levels. It's happening certainly at the economic level, although the argument has been very half-hearted. The official government position is we have no choice. That's actually what they say, because they feel they don't. They just feel there's no other option at this point. They played out the string as long as they could, and Russia finally insisted that now this is happening, and so we're going to go ahead and do it. And I would say, although there are certainly presentations of more positive economic scenarios that take place in the Kyrgyzstani media, they're quite skewed, and I don't think they're taken that seriously. And Kyrgyzstan still has, compared to the rest of the region, a relatively free media, so you do still see quite a bit of genuine discussion or presentation of real concerns about the economic impact. So I don't think the attitude on the street is this is going to be great. I think the attitude on the street is more fear and trepidation, especially as the issues with the Russian economy are visible for everyone. You know, the Kyrgyz som and the Russian ruble are now essentially 1-to-1, when they've normally been about 1.5 to 1. So you can't ignore it. Normatively, you know, you feel in Kyrgyzstan an effort to create a normative narrative about the Eurasian Economic Union. You have these manufactured protests and demonstrations in favor of Russia or in favor of Eurasianism that take place not infrequently in Kyrgyzstan and that feel very artificial in terms of the numbers of people participating, in terms of the quality of their arguments and their passion, which can tend to actually be quite low often. It can sometimes be kind of comical. But it's very present in the media sphere, and there's very much, but I think really, I think we have to give credit to people in Central Asia. They see through that. They know that this is an imposed narrative of rejoining Russia and becoming part of a greater Eurasia as a positive development in their cultural life. And I've never gotten a sense in Kyrgyzstan that there's a great deal of support outside of ethnic Russian or ethnic non-Kyrgyz populations for rejoining a Russian-led Eurasian space on a normative level.
Okay. Well, looking at the old member states, it's also a very interesting situation. My impression is that debates have been very general, very little attention to detail, no real debate with regard to specific issues. I personally don't think that the functionalist arguments work, in the sense that it's very difficult even to analyze economic advantages and disadvantages. In a way, you don't even have a free trade area, you put a partial customs union, which is partly implemented, then you put a single economic space. It just doesn't work. It's also very poor bottom-up process. I mean, traditional theories of regionalism, as far as I know, it very much depends on business pressure. You don't see that at all. If anything, at the moment, there seems to be the Eurasian Economic Commission is developing a dialogue, formal dialogue with so-called business dialogue with businesses in the member states. But if you actually look at who participates in that business dialogue, it's pretty much the kind of organized interest groups. So it does leave a serious question as to, who is who in there. As far as the newer member states are concerned, I've looked more specific. So going back to for example, Belarus, it is very clear that given the lack of bottom-up pressure, Lukashenko it boils it all down to gas price and securing the position of the regime. The new member states, Armenia, again, what we've seen is that there are very non-transparent, informal, personalized negotiations with the top of the head of state to secure the commitment to the Union with things like roadmaps, details, negotiations taking place later. You know, in September 2013, Sargsyan agreed for Armenia to join, and then in March, April 2014, he suddenly realized his hope that he'll get exemptions on certain commodities is not going to happen. You know, Kremlin is not going to agree to that. So it's a certain methodology that we seem to see replicated both within and without in the Union. And clearly in the case of Armenia, security was undoubtedly the main issue there.
Well, yes, just a few words about Kazakhstan. Yes, as I mentioned, I mean, there are clearly very pragmatic reasons for Kazakhstan to be part of the Eurasian economic integration and this enlarged market and foreign investment attraction. But I think also on some level, especially with the generational kind of divide, it is very important for all the generation to view the Eurasian Economic Union as part of some resistance or as part of some alternative way to the inequalities of Western capitalism. It was especially very evident in the course of the financial crisis of 2008 when the Kazakh bankers and Kazakh financial sector was hit so much. But as a whole, I mean, Kazakhstan, I think, never mentioned that it has no other choice, although it is true, it actually has no other choice.
Yeah, I think it's also depend on at which level do we want to look at, of course, because the average citizen will have their own narrative about why their country needs to integrate. That can be different from the political elites. And one good example is Uzbekistan. I mean, no one in Uzbekistan among the elites will tell you we will become a member of the Eurasian Economic Union. But if you look at the few surveys we have, you have a majority of Uzbek population who would say, well, we would welcome that because economically that would be better and more migrants and so on. So I think you have a gap between what is the average perception, I mean, of the citizen and the political elites. And I think the feeling of belonging to a kind of geopolitical entity is relatively strong. And in fact, it became stronger with the Ukraine, even if the Ukrainian crisis also polarized more clearly the Central Asian public opinion. But I think you have this feeling of more or less belonging, even if you don't really want to, but like no other choice belonging in terms of geopolitical identity. So I would be a little bit less affirmative than you on the fact that those in Kyrgyzstan who wouldn't be part of the minorities wouldn't be like in favor. I think that the fear of China or the so impressive rates of arrival of China in the everyday life of Central Asians was really impressive, and that suddenly gave more flavor to Russia. And for those who really follow the region since years, I mean, in the first half of the 2000s, people were welcoming China as the counterbalance to Russia. A few years later, second half of the 2000s, people were welcoming Russia's revival to counterbalance China because China arrived too quickly and so quickly. So I think that's an important element that, well, if you have to make a choice, you want Chinese good, but geopolitically, you still feel like you want to be part of the northern section and not of the southern one. For Tajikistan, this geopolitical narrative seems to me very present, both at the political level and among the population, because there is this fear of Afghanistan. There is really this feeling like, okay, we don't want to become like Afghanistan, we have Iran as a neighbor, so there is no really other choice than to exit and connect to the big Russian neighbor, also knowing that their relationship with Uzbeks are difficult. And then something that is important there that has been aggravated by the Ukrainian crisis is that the conspirological perception of the world and the kind of deep distrust of the West make also this kind of geopolitical identity of Eurasia something that seems to me relatively shared by the population. So I think it's contradictory. You may have people who would say, well, the West, I don't trust the West, I don't trust China, so I won't be part of this Eurasia. But inside of this Eurasian geopolitical identity, there is too much pressure of Russia on my own country, and it's too much ethnically Russian-centered or too imperial, while it could be more equal and so on. So people can have nuanced vision, I think, depending on the level you ask them, I mean, to situate themselves.
Very. Okay. So All right, so let's open this up. I think we have a microphone there, so if I could ask you to use the mic, because we are taping this. You will be on the record and part of the broadcast. So please identify yourself and your institutional affiliation, and also tell us who you would like to ask your question to. So, yeah, Jack.
A couple of you asked the question of...
Jack, tell us who you are.
Jack Snyder. I teach political science at Columbia. A couple of you asked the question of whether the EEU is a rules-based organization, and you concluded that it isn't really. But then I think it was you, Nate, who said that the question is who makes the rules, or maybe Rilka, whoever. And so, well, then that implies that, well, there is something like a rule-based system going on here, but the rules of who has power in reality may not be the same as the rules of who has power on paper. But maybe you were driving at something more than the fact that Russia is in the driver's seat. I mean, there are other issues about rules, such as that when you say who makes the rules, does that imply that, well, you have one rule one day, and then you just rewrite the rule at the convenience of the powerful the next day, which is not what we would normally call a rule. We would call that a policy. Is that what you're driving at? Or is it something else that you're driving at that, well, there are rules in the sense of habits of behavior, but they're just not rules that are oriented towards making an efficient, depoliticized market, like we think the rules of maybe the European Union are trying to do that, but maybe they're not either. So I'm trying to ask you to unpack what you mean by rules and what you mean by saying it's not rule-based, and is it just that there's a pretense of rules, or is it just that they're rules that are not working in a kind of rational, legal, Weberian, efficiency-oriented sense? And then where I'm really going with this is the question of Ukraine and the proposals that Ukraine could somehow be part of an association with the European Union and an association with a Russia-centered system at the same time, and whether those different rule systems, if that's what they are even remotely compatible. Thank you.
God, fascinating. There are rules. Russia has rules. I mean, for example, Russia has, while selectively sort of engaging in various sort of Kremlin initiatives with regard to various oligarchs or other areas, it has, for example, modernized the civil code. And this is one of probably the fourth biggest revision of the civil code, and it's actually at the moment a very good document. So there are rules at the level of domestic legislation, and certainly Russia, with actually also the US support of many institutions, have very good laws on the book in many areas. Same thing with regard to the customs union. The customs code, for example, was done by implementing a number of international conventions, introducing very progressive things like electronic declaration, single window, sort of various provisions about the registration of economic agents. The issue is that they're used, firstly, that there isn't sufficient attention to crafting them. So there is this whole, I suppose, culture of casual legality, which is especially pronounced at the level of the region, of the regional integration. So there is very little attention to that, and the geopolitical agenda makes that even less possible. And second, that there is this instrumental use of rules. Rules are sometimes used, as the European Union very often says, things are imposed by Russia without consulting the customs union, but in order to be lifted, the customs union has to be consulted. So no, we can't lift it actually then. The reason I use the image of what matters is who makes the rules, not what the rules are, is that actually if one looks at the details, for example, at Russia's objections to the DCFTA, for example, in relation to the so-called flooding of the Russian market with EU goods, mislabeled EU goods, or, for example, their concerns about technical standards. If one even takes these technical standards, the customs union technical standards that have been adopted arguably reflect international practice, they're WTO-based, and they also use European Union standards as a basis. Okay, the Russians don't like beef hormones, but nonetheless, it is very much within this trend of trying to implement international practice. However, what is a technical issue and what is compatible within, if you're engaged in a technical process and could be made compatible, is escalated to the geopolitical level. So when one looks at it, it becomes clear that there is very little interest in functional compatibility. What matters is that Russia makes the rules, and in a way, it is the norm producer. It's not a norm taker anymore. It's an equal power, and in a way deploys the Eurasian Economic Union as a rule-based space within its traditional sphere of influence. So in a way, we see an upgraded game in this sense. So rules become a form of contestation, and there is very little interest, at least at the moment, that we've seen about crafting better rules or determining their functional compatibility. Also actually visible in the Russia's WTO behavior.
I like the term casual legality. It's wonderful. Yeah. Dave.
I mean, I wouldn't have much to add to that. I think it's everything's there, a terrific answer. I did want to link it into something Alex recently wrote about the creation by Russia of an alternative model of sovereignty and of its own set of rules for how sovereignty will be interpreted based on its own decisions as the arbiter of sovereignty. And I think this gets to the question that Rilka raised at the end of her talk about how can the European Union, interact with the EEU, given that it is increasingly becoming based on a model in which Russia is the arbiter of which rules are valid, where sovereignty applies, where sovereignty doesn't apply. And that's entirely contrary to the European Union model. It's contrary to the structure, the rules-based international legal structure. It's very hard to see how they can functionally interact at this stage, given that they're they're increasingly diverging in the very basis of how they operate.
Very interesting. Yeah. Peter.
Sure. I'm Peter Clement. I'm a visiting professor here at SIPA. I actually have 3 questions, but I'm going to keep it to 2.
All right.
First, I read recently that last summer the Chinese had announced some rather grand initiative that involved over $6 billion that was going to be targeted at some Silk Road project for all of Central Asia, highways, pipelines, railways. Then I also read that Tajikistan was getting $1.8 billion, which was actually worth a lot more than all the remittances they get from the migrants who represent about 40% of their revenues. I don't know if these numbers are still accurate. I think they're a year old, 2 years old.
Yeah, 50% of the budget.
So in light of what you've been saying, if in fact there's this angst now about whether the EEU and we're not so sure how much we really love Russia and we don't have options, are we going to see a resurgence now of interest in China? That's question number 1. Second question, if hundreds of thousands of migrants do not go back to Russia and actually perform much needed labor that apparently Russians don't want to do, will this highlight the demographic problems inside Russia even more, or are we going to see more Russian citizens from the North Caucasus suddenly going north to fill these vacancies? And are there socio-political implications of this lack of migrant work from Central Asia?
Great. Marlene, why don't you take the first stab at that?
Yeah. Well, I think the Central Asian countries are all very much welcoming Chinese money in any case. So they see it as complementary. China comes with investment, and labor and jobs are provided by Russia, and security is provided by Russia. So for them, it works relatively well. The big amount of Chinese money also is, I mean, the numbers are complicated because it's also the Chinese system of making loan. They make loan to their own Chinese society to build road and so on. That doesn't create any jobs. So indeed, that's improving infrastructure, no doubt about that, for Central Asia, for Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, that's great. Only China can pay for roads and infrastructure, no one else, or maybe some kind of international financial institution sometime. But that doesn't create jobs, and that also creates a lot of resentment. So for the moment, the Chinese so-called Silk Road initiative is relatively compatible with what has been the Russian position in the region, which is a little bit of investment, but not too much, security provider and job provider. So it works relatively well, and I don't think it's seen as contradictory for the moment, because China doesn't come with a very political narrative about it, the price, the political or the geopolitical price to pay for this investment. On your second question, that's a very good one. So two things. First, in some sector, if really the Russian economy is shrinking on some element, there will be no need for some jobs. Like if the construction sector is totally frozen, well, you won't need any job on that sector. What will be, of course, important is that, and what I think would really happen is that the Central Asian, they don't have job at home in any case. So they may try to migrate in other countries. Turkey is becoming a more and more important destination, but they don't have a lot of options. So probably they will go back to Russia. They will be more illegal. They will have less money because they will be offered a smaller salary in more difficult conditions, but they will continue to go back. I don't think Russian citizens will be ready to clean the streets, whatever the situation. I mean, and you can compare with Western Europe. I mean, you may have millions of unemployed, that you still have some niches where nobody wants to work. So the two mechanics don't meet. But for the North Caucasian, I agree. They are already kind of, I mean, so many people are leaving Dagestan in particular to take, so they compete with the Central Asian exactly on the same niches. So probably if it's become more difficult for Central Asian to migrate because of the new migration law, or just because it's less viable to go to Russia if they are not sure to get the job, clearly North Caucasian will continue to leave their region and to take their job. And of course that will probably aggravate the xenophobia, which originally is very much anti-North Caucasian before even being Central Asian. And that will of course accentuate or highlight the demographical problem of Russia. But the real demographical problem of Russia, if you ask employers and CEO and director of private firm, it's skilled population. You have two problems. You have the unskilled, but they don't have enough skills population. And on that, the Central Asian, except some Kazakh engineer and so on, the Central Asian cannot solve that problem. So that's another problem, which is a deep problem of human capital in Russia.
Anyone else like to weigh in on this? Good. Yep. Cindy.
Thank you. Thank you for a wonderful set of talks, by the way. I really
Tell us who you are.
it. Cynthia Roberts. I am a professor at Hunter College and also an affiliate of the Saltzman Institute here at Columbia. So actually I had two questions, but Peter asked one of them about China. So now I only have one question and also a small comment. No, I'm not going to ask about Uzbekistan. Sorry. You'll have to get the mic back. So quick comment and then my question. The comment is that I'm doing some work on both BRICS Development Bank, new institutions and rules, and also the World Bank doing business comparing China and Russia. And everything that you've said about rules and norms applies in the second case of the doing business. There are strong interests in doing things correctly. There's incentives. There are good people working, and there's been good results. But the implementation, of course, is more in the informal politics and economics realm. And the implementation is obviously also impeded by the scope. It's for small business, not for anything Kremlin connected. So I think this is a bigger problem for Russia, and we all know that. On the BRICS side, it'll be more interesting. It's still unfolding. Whose norms will apply? We have a mixture of democracies and non-democracies, and the fights over the new development bank are starting. But it's interesting, the Russian officials that I've talked to are more open to a more rule-based system. They haven't ruled it out. So, of course, it'll be a lot of Chinese money, and the Chinese are keen not to lose it. The question is this. I'm curious about where the support for this comes from pre-Ukraine. You know, in other words, there's clearly a geopolitical dimension, and you can imagine that coming right from the Kremlin. But there was also, as all of you said, the disappointment of the failure of a rules-based system that could work. And I haven't worked on this closely, so I'm interested in where the principal support was. The few people I've asked on the economic side had very mixed views, right? It could help in some sectors, but it was unclear that it would help in others. It was very contradictory. So I'm curious, apart from the geopolitical side, where was the rest of the support coming from for this Russian initiative? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Rilka, do you want to take a stab at that? Maybe you can weigh in on the Kazakhstan side too afterwards.
Pre-Ukraine, I mean, there is 20 years of attempts to develop regional integration. There is undoubtedly a path-dependent process and institutional learning. Some of it we see that has been taken on board, some of it hasn't, which is also interesting. I mean, certainly with the Eurasian Customs Union, we see that it actually builds on previous initiatives. And interestingly enough, there's also been quite a sort of lengthy academic debate about rules and also the law of regional integration in the post-Soviet space. So one of these is path dependence and learning. The second sort of pre-Ukraine source, I think, is imitating the European Union and the whole perception that successful regional integration goes with a rules-based regime and goes, especially deep economic integration, goes actually with a certain set of rules-based international elements. So there is this very sort of strong symbolic aspect to it. If you want to be a region leader, you have to be rule-clothed. So there is a signaling function to that. And certainly imitating the European Union predates the Ukraine crisis. And lastly, I find the role of law in Russia, I find absolutely fascinating. And I remember the debates back in the early 1990s. For example, again, if I use the example of the Civil Code, which at that time, it was adopted in 1994, and it was there was a quality of enlightenment about it. In fact, it was described by one of the key drafters. It was like peeling off layers of old paintings to restore something. They were looking at the old imperial drafts of the civil code that was never adopted, but there was a very significant, robust imperial draft. And there is a fascination with the sort of symbolic value of legality. And it is there. You cannot deny that it exists. The problem is that idealistic, sort of almost spiritual value of legality is not necessarily connected to the functional value of how things are done. And it very often remains an intellectual fascination and a symptom of modernity.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, would you like to talk about the Kazakh case on this?
Yeah, I mean, it was a really great answer from Rilka. But as for Kazakhstan, I mean, yes, the first idea that President Nazarbayev came up 20 years ago was very much based on the fact that Kazakhstan does not want to lose the value chains which had been created in the Soviet times. It remained really dependent on Russian manufacturing capacity, being a resource-based country, and also it does really it hoped to use some of the manufacturing capacities in Ukraine, the transit capacity, and but going back to the China question, I think that this pattern has much altered with the Chinese investment. I think that the pattern of trade and value chains will be changed towards China in a very soon future, and it is a very interesting role that the Chinese investment are playing. I mean, even in terms of regional coordination, so to say, we had, for instance, two countries like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, which had always fought on some of the issue, and with the Chinese pipeline now, gas pipeline, they are now sitting at one table and having really high-level visits to each other. So I do think, well, at least I do hope that this level of coordination will increase in Central Asia, and that may be beneficial for all of the Central Asian states, because I mean. For Chinese, clearly, I mean, the security of this investment, they don't want to their gas pipelines to be disrupted by any conflict and everything. So maybe that will create some kind of another pole in the Eurasian space for integration in Central Asia.
Yeah. Marlene, do you want to?
Yeah, just two sentences on this issue. I think for Russia, what's really one of the crystallizing moments is the 2008 economic crisis. It has been such a shock in Russia that really this idea that, okay, we are trying to move toward integration with the West, and the West is destined to fail. And if you look at the academic and policy production of the most Western-minded Putinian elites, if you look at what Valdai Club is producing, I mean, and it's not propaganda, it's a shared belief that the West economically is going to lose the battle. So you suddenly have this idea that, okay, why are we trying to integrate? Better to try to resist and do something on our own, because in 20 years from now, the global world picture will be so different that the West will be totally kind of the small part, and everything would have changed. And then while Russia would pay now the price of reform for integrating with something which in 20 years everything will have to be redone. And I think that's a very deep and a really shared perception that also explains why, I mean, 2008, and then really this idea that, okay, let's do something else. Or I think it's a strategy of gaining time. It's postponing the moment where the big reform will have to be done, because with this idea that in 20 years the picture will be so different that Russia will have to replay all the cards in any case.
Great. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is just bundle last couple of questions that we might have, and we'll go back to the panel for one last go-around. Yes, sir.
Thanks for panelists' talk. My name is Simar from the mission of China to UN. Since China has been mentioned, I'm not going to talk about China's investments in Central Asia, but I have to correct the long perception about China's investment relating to Marlene's saying. Actually, as far as I know, when China invests in Central Asia relating to road building, bridge, etc., China normally will cooperate with local enterprises. Chinese enterprises will send engineers to do the training job. On top, except the some technology training, the majority of labor comes from the local country, from the local region.
Good.
But my question would like, I would like to ask relating to Kazakhstan to Ms. Manakova. Sorry. Since Kazakhstan is going to hold national election, it's going to be held very soon. I would like to ask some basic knowledge about this. Is there any debate on the among the academic circles about Kazakhstan's economic future relating to the EU? Is there any impact of the incoming national election on the Kazakhstan's EU policy or position? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good and timely question. Take one more in the back, Andrew.
Hi, my name is Andrew Lowson. I'm a second-year student here at Columbia, SIPA. My question is that it seems like Tajikistan in for like a slow, steady collapse, given that they're kind of outside the kind of EU family. So what's really next? What can they do to really develop their economy? And do you see this as kind of forcing a degree of fence mending with other neighbors who are left out, like Uzbekistan, for example?
Okay, great. So let's take one last round of comments, and maybe Nate, we can start with you. Go to Marlene, and we'll give Rilka the last word. Yeah.
Sure. I'll make a quick comment on both of those questions. In terms of Kazakhstan, I'm not sure. Aitolkyn can give her own version. I don't see the national elections changing the stance of the government towards the Eurasian Economic Union. I think certainly these elections are about continuity. They're about renewing the what they call the mandate for President Nazarbayev, which I think is a rather deceptive thing to call an election in which he will win 99% of the vote. Anyway, it's about continuity. It's about continuing the same policies that have been in place. Now, that policy has changed, as we've been discussing. It's already changed in the last year and a half, as Kazakhstan in particular has really drastically reappraised its commitment to this project. So I think already that shift away from Kazakhstan committing to regional integration within the EU, that shift has already happened, and I think that shift will continue. On Tajikistan, I wouldn't say that Tajikistan is facing a slow, steady collapse. I would say Tajikistan has had a slow, steady collapse, and maybe not even that slow. Tajikistan has collapsed. It's not that, and this is a debate among Central Asianists that comes up every once in a while where we're sort of waiting for the Central Asian collapse. In Tajikistan's case, it has happened. This is what it looks like when the equivalent of 50% of your GDP comes from remittances. And as one of the panelists in last week's conference said, if there were no remittances, 54% of your country would live in extreme poverty. It has collapsed. I think the Eurasian Economic Union could provide some measure of continuation of the same economic policies as an option for Tajikistan. But I don't see them developing a different option outside of the EU. I think there certainly are positive, constructive cases to be made that intra-regional trade in Central Asia would offer a way out of the dead end that Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan in particular have found themselves in, but without a change in the political commitments, in particular of Uzbekistan, but also interacting with that of the Tajik leadership. I don't think that's possible. I don't think that will happen.
Great. Marlene.
Yeah, let me add to that it's very difficult for Tajikistan, even if the country was led by a very wise and transparent regime, to really have something to develop economically. The agriculture is destined to remain very limited. Developing private small trade, it means you're trading Chinese goods or a little bit of things with Afghanistan, or potentially you really need to have the Uzbek market opening up, otherwise it's not really making sense. But maybe what is the most important, and Alex has been working on that, is that if this country could stop offshoring, or if the elites could stop offshoring a large part of the few state revenue they have, that would also bring a lot of more money. So the country will still be poor, but a little bit less. So you really have to realize how much the rent seeking mechanism are important, and the predatory logics of the elites. So all the public money is just offshore out of the country. On the Kazakh question, I think one of the important elements is that, of course, even if the elections are probably just to be a repetition of what they have been before, you have a growing resentment among a certain young, urban population toward the Nazarbayev regime, and as it cannot really be expressed publicly, it's moved toward the Eurasian Economic Union. So in a sense, when you are criticizing the Eurasian construction, you are criticizing Nazarbayev's last big decision and so on. So I think things are becoming more and more politicized, and it's relatively, that probably make him relatively unhappy to see this connection being made around his name. So there is a way of expressing resentment around the Eurasian Economic Union that are in fact linked to this probably new generation waiting for political change. But Aya will develop.
Yeah, I think that the presidential elections that will happen this April, they're something of more importance rather than just to continue the mandate of the president, because first of all, they were called early, and that for the reason that because the government is right now thinking of implementing some second row of reforms. And this could be really some really critical reforms, because the country said that it will apply for the foreign financing from the World Bank and from the other international financial organizations, and these loans usually come as part of some reform agenda. And Kazakhstan has been criticized for not continuing the economic reforms because it enjoyed the time of high oil prices, and now maybe it will be time not only to make a devaluation, which people in Kazakhstan very much expect that it will happen after the elections, but also for some really, really important critical reforms elsewhere in the economic sector. And as for Tajikistan, I think it's also an interesting thing that there are hopes or expectations that maybe the Kyrgyz re-export business will move to Tajikistan because it's also a member of WTO. Maybe that will provide some source of revenue for the Tajik economy.
Great, thanks. Welcome.
Just probably general point, because I think most of the things have been said. I mean, this is clearly a personalized project, highly dependent on these three presidents. And the manner of its expansion is also very much related to personal commitment and ensuring discipline by the incumbent within its country. It's, in this sense, it works with domestic regimes. It supports domestic regimes. It doesn't touch domestic regimes. And that is one of the main, actually, questions that remains as to how viable it can be, because what we see, in effect, is it simply sort of upgrades on the regional level the type of policy making that exists domestically, which is probably fine, but not necessarily when you try to deal with a deep economic integration project that would secure economic growth and so on. I mean, Nazarbayev has clearly demonstrated that he's been very good at balancing domestic interests and putting limits to the economic agenda and political agenda to Russia, but that does not necessarily actually change the nature of the whole gesture of integration, which actually works with rent-seeking regimes, relies on rent-seeking regimes, and does not attempt to modernize them.
Well, that's terrific. Well, first I want to thank everyone here who braved the snow to come to this panel, because I think you saw something here that was just a very rich discussion, really informative. I want to thank all the panelists for their wisdom and insights, and really a fascinating topic. It's moving really quickly, and I hope you all come back again soon and share your perspectives with us. Thanks so much. This has been wonderful.